Mixing with Mike plugin of the week comes from the Plugin Alliance. It's TOMO Audiolabs Lisa. This is a mastering grade dynamic EQ, and it's pretty sophisticated and does some unique things that no other processor that I know of does. Essentially, it has somewhat of a passive EQ type of design where the incoming signal is split into 6 bands, and then each of the bands will allow you to apply the equalization separately or independently within its own filter set or within its own signal path of the sixth, and then it gets all summed back together in the end. And this is somewhat along the lines of a design of a passive EQ. And therefore, if you want to boost within a particular frequency, you're essentially cutting away everything other than what you want to add in, and then the output gain makes up for whatever gain loss there is. Now, I'm not sure about the whole internal design of it. This is a very high priced mastering grade dynamic EQ, and end-to-end components are top-notch in terms of the transformers being used. It's all discrete components, so there's no potentiometers, and just top-notch every way through it. It also has an optical dynamic processing for the actual dynamic EQ, and the way that it's actually applied is very unique. You won't find this in any digital processor that I know of. Now, let's dive into it because there's a lot to unpack here, and it's a very confusing or overwhelming interface. So let's break it down, and then we'll more or less get an idea of what's going on. On the simple end of it, we basically have a stereo component that can be made mid-side. It starts, so we have the two sides linked at this point. We have an input control and an output gain control. There's also a master input gain and a master output gain, but these two are in the digital realm, while this is using the built-in circuitry as emulated by Plugin Alliance. We have a high pass filter here. Now it's interesting. The usually when you get a high pass filter, it'll come at some form of a fixed dB per octave, first order, second order, third order. But this actually shifts or changes. So it's actually steeper third order as you're going from like 20 hertz, but then as you go up higher above 80, it starts to go to second order, and then first order by the time you get to 180 on the very top end of it here. So we have the basic of that. There's no low pass filter on the opposite end, just a little FYI. In the middle, we have 6 bands. They all have a dynamic component of it. So if we look at the top row of knobs, the top major knobs here, they're all boosts for the individual 6 channels. And then for each of them, there's an individual on-off stage. So we have that. That's the common component. The frequency select knob is also common. So those are the 3 big knobs there. So boost or attenuation, frequency selection, and then this is the threshold for the dynamic EQ. So the big knobs across there are essentially the primary components of the way that this works. We have the on-off switches for each. Now, the low boost band and the high boost band are only boost. You can only boost, and it's a shelving EQ. The shelving EQ actually has a slope, and the slope basically changes the shape of the filter, and it gives you somewhat of a Pultec kind of characteristic where you have the slight dip before you start the boost to the shelf. And that allows you to sort of focus the positioning of the shelf better. That's sort of the magic of the Pultec EQ. The interesting thing is they have that also for the top end. So it's a similar type of thing where you have the slope for the top end, which is also very cool. And you don't typically see that. I don't think any of the Pultecs do that on the top end, only on the low end. So we have that component. The 4 middle bands, low, low mid, and high, have some additional components. So we'll start with that first, and then we'll work our way down to the dynamics, because that's where it starts to get a little tricky. So we have the individual on-offs for all of them, And then we have a switch for each individual band that allows you to either boost or cut. So when you set a certain dB, you set this to 4, then that would be a cut, that would be a boost. Okay, so the basics of it there is just a simple, this is kind of an old technology. You used to see this like on things like the old Helios EQ, where it would just have a switch on it that would make peak or dip for the EQ. So that's the basics of it. Now, on the low band and on the high band, you have a shelf option, right? So you have a fixed shelf here, but that only boosts. And if you wanted to attenuate, you still have the ability to do that. You take it up or do it in the low band here, right? So this allows you to do some really cool things in terms of stair stepping, shelving EQs, which is kind of cool. Where you could do a dip in the low mids and then do a boost on the low end and sort of have it all kind of smooth the way that it kind of works together. So there's lots of options there. And then you have pretty much from a broad bell curve up to a sharp bell curve. So you have your Q selections that are set up here. The rest of the switches start to work within the dynamics. So each of the other bands, the 2 mid bands, do not have the shelving EQ. You just have the 4 options here, but you have 4 full parametric EQs and 2 shelving EQs with a high pass filter. So let's get to the dynamics and talk a little bit about that. Now, when we get to it, we have a threshold knob. So the threshold, there's an independent threshold for each band, which is great. Then you have the ability to turn that on or off, right? So it defaults on here. The ratio switch will turn it from a compressor into a limiter. Now, essentially the way they describe it, because they don't actually give you ratios, and often things, especially like for optical components or tube components, the ratios are sort of generalized because I think it's variable depending upon the frequency or the content program material, what you're feeding in and how hard you're hitting the component. So there's some factors there. Essentially, the way to describe it is that the ratio button in, giving you the limiter setting, will give you a more aggressive compression, right? So as you're working with it, that's just something to keep in mind, right? In terms of the aggressiveness, you want more aggressive, hit the ratio, otherwise leave it out. Now, the attack release circuit here is gives you a series of settings, and I'm going to zoom in on them here just so you can kind of understand. You'll see it's FF, SF, FM, S, and basically as you go through all of these, the first letter is the attack, right? So fast, slow, medium, slow. Okay. The second is the release. So fast, medium, slow. So you have these combinations of different settings allowing you band by band to kind of go through and set up your attack release characteristic. How aggressively do you want it to kick in? Okay, so you have that, and then there is also a gain reduction meter that you'll see here. The one other function that you'll see here, and this ends up being important, you'll see this on the 4 middle bands, is one that will turn it from a compressor into an expander. Now, the way that, if you think about compression, essentially you're decreasing dynamic range, and with expansion you're increasing dynamic range, whether it's upward compression or downward or upward expansion or downward compression, however you sort of dice it up. The determination of whether it's an expander or a compressor is set here, and then if you're attenuating, that will change the way that this works. So it's worth kind of going here to a separate chart to sort of explain this, because there are some unique features here about the way that it works. So here's my crappy drawing of a bell curve here. So let's just say this is our boost. So what happens is when we set compression, and let's just say that we do a boost, and let's just say that this is 3 dB. Normally, when you have a dynamic EQ, let's say that the dynamic EQ is in a compression mode, what it would do is it would take this bell curve and essentially flatten it out, or maybe even make it go below. So the bell curve would maintain its Q bandwidth and actually lessen or collapse. Essentially, what this does, however, is something that is a little bit different. If you can imagine here, a narrower cue with the same boost point sort of built in, right? So I'll just draw that out. What happens is when you have compression, rather than just attenuating the whole signal, the first part of it will drive the signal towards the zero gain, right? Towards unity gain, right? So it'll push it. But essentially what it's doing, rather than collapsing the whole signal and bringing it down, maintaining the cue that you set, it actually starts to collapse the cue. So it makes it narrower. So it's pushing this part towards the zero gain line. And if you go beyond a certain point for heavier compression, it actually does flatten this out so that it moves towards the zero gain line. And the same happens if you attenuate. So the interesting artifact of this is that if you attenuate, and let's see if I can draw this here with my mouse, essentially what will happen in compression mode is that this will actually push towards the gain line, so it'll actually be adding gain in and around that area, or sharpening up or narrowing that attenuation. Okay, so the basic idea here is it's not adding any more gain than what's already there, and I'll get to how you do that next, but it's collapsing essentially the cue. And that's an important way to understand that. So if you understand the dynamics of it, that's not the way normal dynamic EQs work. So if we're doing expansion, what ends up happening is that in expander mode, what you'll get is the same cue bandwidth somewhat maintained, but what you do is you'll get sort of a narrower boost on the top end. So the expander, if it's expanding upward with a boost, will essentially push more gain, but at a narrower cue above what's already there, and you will end up in a similar type of thing here. So I'm just trying to draw it out. The expander will move away from the zero gain line. So if you're boosting, it will expand upward. If you're attenuating, it will expand downward with a narrower cue. That's the basic conceptual idea. And this is what makes it unique in terms of the way it works. The other thing about the technology for it being optical as opposed to being, like a VCA circuit or something along those lines, is that optical components and true Varamute components that are used for compression, part of the beauty of them is they have a tendency to have a musical value. They're very responsive to the program material that's being fed into them, whereas a VCA tends to be less so. And therefore, you'll get some kind of natural, people will call it musical response in terms of the compression characteristics and the way that it works, just based on the fact that that's what optical circuits do, or a Varamute type of circuit would do. And then the rest is about how you dial in all of the settings. So we'll get into some audio examples for that. And sorry, it kind of takes a little bit to sort of explain what it does, just so you understand what the overall, conceptual design and idea of it is, so you know how to use it properly and understand what it's doing and not be frustrated because it's doing something different than what you think it should be doing. There's an output gain here, which I described. It's also a mix control, so this is your wet-dry control. And then there's a master threshold. So once you've gone through the individual bands and you've made your settings or whatever for gain or attenuation, whatever it is that you're doing, then the master threshold will allow you to take all of them and raise or lower them, so you can make it a bit more or less aggressive. So those two controls, the mix and the master threshold, give you a lot of additional controls. Down at the bottom, we have the normal BrainWorks sort of setup here with input, output gain, the TMT technology, parameter link, MS mode if you want to work in MS mode, auto listen mode, sidechain link, and then the mono maker, stereo width, headroom control, and just basically allowing you to essentially drive the input and output up or down in direct opposition to each other. so you can drive the components more or less. And there's one other feature I forgot about, which is critically important, which I'll get back to, and the TX drive. So this is a new feature here. The TX drive is a modeling of a transformer, an undisclosed transformer by Plug-in Alliance. And so this is added in. I assume they eventually will start adding this into all of their plugins that have this added, which already have the TMT, and it allows you to drive some low and low mid frequency saturation, which is what transformers are most known for. And so it will allow you to sort of just drive rather than you could take that out. So we'll have a look at that. The one other feature here, which I sort of skipped over, and this is really critical, two things. One, there's the in-out, right? The master in-out for everything. Seems like it should be bigger than that, given like the whole thing. And there's also one other feature here called the dry mute. One of the unique ways that, or unique things about the dynamic design of this, the dynamic EQ design, is that most dynamic EQs will either apply the dynamic processing pre the filter stage or post the filter stage. So what you'll get is that movement within the bandwidth of the structure of what's fit there. But because this is a series of 6 parallel pathways, each with its own filter, the way that they've actually designed the dynamics is that it actually is the filter circuit itself. And that's how you get that collapsing Q for the compression phase, right? That's how that basically fits in. So it's all connected right there. So when you hit the dry mute, essentially what you're hearing is the differential. You're hearing whatever it is that you're doing. So if you have this and there's no EQ or anything, you're not going to hear anything. As soon as you do a boost, you'll only hear what it is that you're boosting. If you apply the dynamics, then you'll hear the dynamics of just what you're boosting, independent of everything else. And that allows you to really kind of focus it in. So that feature is it's like crazy unique for analog components. It's one thing to do it all in the digital realm where you focus on just the particular aspects of it. BrainWorks is really great at doing that type of thing, particularly with compressors like or EQs like their dynamic digital V3 EQ, which is great. Okay, so let's have a quick listen. Let's go through some listening exercises. Enough talking here. There's just a certain amount of this you have to kind of go through so you have a broader understanding of it. So let's start with the dynamic sections off here for a second so we don't have anything. The thresholds are essentially out at this point, so that's not doing anything. And let's just kind of go through some basics here. So let's start. I think I just have a drum beat here just to kind of keep it simple. Right, so that's not a massive kind of difference. Just wanted to show off the TX drive there for a second. So let's move in and do what would be kind of like a typical thing that I would do here. So let's just start here. Maybe what I'll start here is to do sort of a low mid attenuation here. So I'll set the cut here. And then I'll take here and I'll go into this. One weird thing about this, and this is true to the hardware, is that when you attenuate, the dry mute doesn't work. Because essentially the way that it attenuates something is within this parallel channel. If you hit the switch here that does the boost cut, it's still a gain, it just flips the phase on it, so the exact amount of gain would then end up get taken away from everything else when it's all summed together. So that's the simplicity of the boost cut knob. So basically it's pretty easy to do, like almost anything that has like this type of design. So that's like an interesting conceptual idea. So I'm glad that they added that in. Let's go here and do a little boost to get a little kind of sub energy out here. So let's start at 51. Let's hear. Right, so you could hear just the Q change there. Just wanted to show that off a little bit here. Go back out of this. Really nice and clean and very open. You could really hear like the mastering grade technology, like in that whole design. So let's move on to just like, let's go to like the high frequency boost here, which is always a shelf. And let's check out this one feature here with the slope. Let's see. Really beautiful and smooth sounding. I really love that slope there. So if I understand it correctly, that it's a shelving EQ. I have it set to 12K, but it's doing a dip there, probably somewhere in the upper eights or 9K. I'm just assuming before it starts to slope upward towards the 12K end of things. And depending upon the design there, we could kind of get that slight dip to kind of focus it up or down. Let's just see if there's a better frequency here. That just seems to be a good place for it, so I'll leave it. All right, so I got that in there. Maybe I'll do kind of a slightly kind of broad attack frequency type of thing. Do something that's pretty smooth. Which leads us perfectly into some dynamic EQ things. So let's just say that I want to kind of work this a bit more with, let's see, I'm going to narrow this up a little bit. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to work this into compression here. So I'm going to turn on the dynamic band here, and then I'm going to move the threshold. So I'll see my gain reduction right here. So we can also set how we want it to move, right? So I can do it here where it narrows it with a fast attack and release. Okay, so I think like the responsiveness of this is a little bit more with the graphics and the way it's translating on my computer. I won't get into all the details, but I got a new computer and there are some glitches a little bit with this, so you're not seeing it quite as responsive as it should look. I'm going to start this with a slower attack and a faster release. Let's see. Right, so it's allowing the queue to sort of maintain, and there are no numbers on the attack and release time. So just say with that slower attack, it's allowing the initial transient to come through with its existing boost and then just sort of collapsing it afterwards. Let's see if we can take something here with this low mid, and let me try to drive that downward with an expander because we're doing an attenuation here. Let me try a slow attack and a fast release. Like it better with the medium release. So again, there, what's happening is it's dynamically expanding it downward during that bit, but also the downward expansion is really centered a bit around the selected frequency, which is somewhere like around 200 there. So I'm going to take the same type of thing, do an upward expansion here on the low ends, right? So that'll kind of narrow, kind of point it upward. And but because we're doing a boost, it'll be increasing it. So this will be an upward expansion. And let's just try that fast. All right, so here what I'm going to do is just do a quick copy and paste here. And on this, I'm going to take out all the dynamic EQs so that we can hear this with dynamic EQ and just static. Either way, you could hear how clear and open the sounds. It's really amazing, really powerful. But let's just see if the dynamics beat out the just static EQ settings. So yeah, so I think you can hear there like just the depth opening up with the movement. And I think one of the key things with using a dynamic EQ, especially in this sort of situation, is like how you're manipulating, the transient energy and the way that it adapts or adjusts the EQ. And with that you create depth, because it's like when you change volume on something, it's like moving it forward or backward. And if you set those dynamic movements with different elements of the mix, kick, snare, etc., kind of triggering it and kind of moving back and forth, you create this feeling of depth that comes out of it. And that's sort of the key to working with it. It takes a little bit of playing around with it, particularly to kind of understand the whole differences between the compression and the expansion and the way that they work within the realm of the boost cut thing. But if you can kind of get over that and sort of understand a bit of the way that it's actually manipulating the audio signal, not just like a straight dynamic EQ the way that you would normally expect it, but kind of working in terms of shaping the cue and working within it in this parallel uh, um, design here, with the 6 channels. It's incredibly powerful. And that top end is just super silky and beautiful. So love that. All right. There you have it. This is a killer one to me, man. Such a completely unique device. Not just that it's like, I think, one of the only dynamic analog EQs in existence, never mind um, it's just such a hard or such a difficult thing to do, but just the fact that it sounds so amazing and super powerful. I just did it on drums here. There's mono versions of it, so you can use it on individual instruments like vocals and stuff like that. I'm sure there's some powerful things you can do in terms of working with sibilance and harshness and things like that, and sort of shifting around the frequency content to move it out of harsh or boxy areas into areas that are more pleasing. Really powerful, unique design, and absolutely worth checking out. So there you have it. Plugin of the week from Plugin Alliance, TOMO Audiolabs. Lisa is the plugin. Check it out. It's fucking awesome.